I'm David Katz. I am the founder and chief scientific officer of Sparrow Pharmaceuticals, and our goal is to spare patients the ravages of steroids, specifically glucocorticoids. So those are a class of steroids. They're different from, say, the anabolic steroids that weightlifters use, but they're exemplified by an endogenous substance called cortisol, which is best known as a stress hormone, but it actually has many, many physiologic functions. Some of the things that cortisol is involved in include regulation of central metabolism, so the metabolism of sugars and fats in the body, weight, blood pressure, bone health. Cortisol is something that in your eye, it helps keep your eye round so you can see. And it's also involved in the brain in regulation of mood and memory consolidation and sleep. So one of the reasons that we wake up in the morning, if it isn't the dog barking or climbing on you, is because your cortisol levels increase through the latter part of the sleep cycle, and that helps wake you up. So it's really a very pleiotropic substance in ordinary concentrations. But there are also people who have tumors, usually, but not always benign, in the pituitary or adrenal or sometimes in other locations of the body that cause a condition called hypercortisolism. So either the tumor itself secretes cortisol in excess of what your body normally experiences, or the tumor secretes something that in turn causes the adrenal to secrete excess cortisol. So that condition, the condition of too much cortisol, is just called hypercortisolism. Cushing's syndrome refers to certain manifestations of cortisol excess. So classic presentation of Cushing's includes both outward signs and internal symptoms. And it's the outward signs that really are thought of as the classic, what's called Cushingoid appearance. So people will have a very round face. They'll have central obesity with tend to have thin limbs, deposition of fat in unusual places, such as above the clavicle, so along the back of the neck. And then also they'll have very thin skin, and they'll have these purple lines on their skin that are called striae. And so those are some of the outward signs that are classical hallmarks of Cushing's syndrome. But remember, I told you that cortisol is also involved in all these physiologic functions. So when cortisol is in excess, rather than helping you to retain healthy levels of sugars and fats in your body, excess cortisol can lead to diabetes, high cholesterol, high triglycerides. Rather than helping to regulate blood pressure, it can cause hypertension. Rather than helping to keep your eye round, it can increase the pressure in your eye, and that's glaucoma. Rather than facilitating bone health, it can cause osteoporosis and osteonecrosis. In the brain, it can cause you to have mood swings, psychosis, cognitive deficits, and it also, a lot of patients with Cushing's have sleep problems because they have high levels of cortisol that are ordinarily associated with waking you up in the morning. Well, they have those all night, and that can make sleep difficult. There's a lot of internal morbidity that's associated with hypercortisolism. That same sort of morbidity is also associated with the glucocorticoid medications, such as prednisone. So anyone who takes long-term or high-dose glucocorticoid medicine to control autoimmune diseases or other conditions is subject to the same morbidity as a patient who has endogenous hypercortisolism. And sometimes the sequelae of the glucocorticoid medications are called exogenous or iatrogenic Cushing syndrome. So all of these things are related, and Sparrow's mission is to treat all of them with a targeted medication that we call Clofutriben. So we really have to think of three different buckets because we're developing Clofutriben for three different indications. So endogenous hypercortisolism is not at all a rare disease. So classical Cushing syndrome, in which the patients have those outward signs, is rare. There are probably about 20,000 patients in the US, but that's really only the tip of the iceberg because there are a lot of people who have cortisol secreting tumors on the adrenal that are not associated with the outward signs of Cushing syndrome, but are associated with the internal morbidity, such as excess diabetes, hypertension, and osteoporosis. We don't know exactly how prevalent that is, but those tumors may be prevalent in up to 1% of the US population. So there are potentially, a few million people in the US who have these adrenal tumors that secrete cortisol, which is also known as autonomous cortisol secretion. So this is a very underdiagnosed condition, and we did some work with Kaiser Permanente, which has now been published, looking at the diagnosed prevalence of ACS on the discovery of an adrenal tumor. So most of these tumors are discovered accidentally when someone undergoes an imaging study for something unrelated and the radiologist says, oh, there's a tumor on your adrenal. So between 2015 and 2022, which is the period that we studied, the probability that a patient who had an adrenal adenoma discovered would then go on to get the key diagnostic test for autonomous cortisol secretion increased 54-fold in 7 years as health systems and physicians and people are becoming more aware of this condition. And then also we're developing Clofutriben for an autoimmune disease called polymyalgia rheumatica, and that is the second most common rheumatic disease. There are probably between 800,000 and 1 million patients with PMR in the US, but there are millions and millions of patients with conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis and asthma, COPD, inflammatory bowel disease, and others who rely on glucocorticoids, and they're at risk of similar morbidity. So our trials are in all three of those areas currently. With respect to classical Cushing syndrome, as well as ACS, autonomous cortisol secretion, the first line treatment for hypercortisolism is surgery. Get rid of the tumor, because that ostensibly would cure the source of the cortisol and cure the disease. That is successful in about 50% of patients with classical endogenous Cushing syndrome. So there are probably about 10,000 patients with endogenous Cushing syndrome who rely on various medications. And the approved drugs for endogenous Cushing syndrome, first of all, are all associated with the risk of something called adrenal insufficiency, which is related to their mechanism of action. It can't be avoided with those drugs. Adrenal insufficiency is when you don't have enough cortisol. So cortisol, aside from being bad when you have too much of it, being good when you have just the right amount of it, it's also bad when you have too little of it, because you can't, for example, mount a stress response if you have too little cortisol. And so if people who have any sort of injury or other event happen in their lives and are adrenal insufficient, they aren't able to recover from that, and that can be fatal. So that's an issue with all of the drugs, and they have to be very carefully monitored and titrated because of that. They also have other safety issues, such as increased liver enzymes indicating liver injury. Some of them are associated with heart arrhythmias. Some of them also have a lot of drug interactions with other drugs, and so can be difficult to use. The result is patients need a lot of monitoring and care just to ensure their safety. And there's lots of switching related to not only appearance of safety, but also the inconvenience of using those drugs. And because you can't really dose them to full efficacy, because if you do, you knock cortisol too low, a lot of patients just don't have adequate efficacy. So there's a lot of churning in that market. For ACS, surgery simply isn't available for most patients. There aren't anywhere near enough adrenal surgeons. There was a publication in, I think, 2022 across basically all of the leading adrenal centers in Europe and the Mayo Clinic in the US, looking at what proportion of patients who were identified as having ACS received surgery at those top centers. It was only about 1 in 6, and it's almost certainly lower in the community. And currently, there are no approved medications for the treatment of autonomous cortisol secretion. Potentially, Clofutriben would be the first or one of the first if we're successful developing it. What are we bringing to these sets of patients? So for endogenous Cushing syndrome, there hasn't been a novel mechanism of action introduced to the therapeutic armamentarium for about 3 decades. So the last new mechanism of action was mifepristone, which is a glucocorticoid receptor antagonist, and that was about 30 years ago. And all of the current medications either reduce cortisol production or block cortisol action. And so they all have this potential to cause adrenal insufficiency, because if you either completely block cortisol synthesis or completely prevent cortisol signaling, that's adrenal insufficiency. Our primary mechanism is to reduce intracellular cortisol, and that's the pool of cortisol that can actually access its receptors, which are also intracellular. But we don't completely turn off the production of cortisol, and we don't completely block its action. So our mechanism of action aims to take cortisol that has access to the receptor from too much toward just right. And so we have currently phase 2 programs ongoing, as I said, both in endogenous Cushing syndrome and in autonomous cortisol secretion. We also have a phase 2 trial ongoing in combination with a glucocorticoid medicine called prednisolone in patients with polymyalgia rheumatica. And because of our distinct mechanism of action, we expect to have low or no risk of adrenal insufficiency. And although the number of patients so far is small, that has been borne out so far in clinical trials. And we have to see whether that continues in larger number of patients. And also, again, with very small patient numbers, there's been no clinical evidence of other meaningful safety issues. So, we're now planning for the next set of endogenous Cushing syndrome, autonomous cortisol secretion, and polymyalgia rheumatica trials in 2025. As well, on the exogenous Cushing syndrome side, we plan expansion to initiate trials in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, as well as at least one other glucocorticoid indication.